Trevor's been doing the lion's share of these talks, and he's tied up taking some visitors round in a bus and then coming back here at about 2 o'clock to give them afternoon tea, and off they've been through the cottage already, so I won the short straw. So this is a little bit about the society, of just because this year's our centenary, having been established in 1913. We'll tell you a little bit about that. And this covers some of the activities that occurred during that 100 years and some of the personalities that were involved. So, let's move it on. I'll sit down and then I won't get in your way. I'll turn the light off. So, way back in the 1910s, there was quite a bit of agitation around Parramatta to form an historical society, but they tried several times and they never got enough interest in it. So that went on for several years, and then finally a meeting was convened after a whole group of prominent people sent a petition to the Mayor asking him to convene a public meeting to form an historical society for Parramatta and District. And that meeting was held on the 4th of December 1913. And it was addressed by the President of the Australian History Society, which is now called the Royal Australian History Society, Frank Walker. And a provisional committee was elected, and the society formed with 47 foundation members. Now this is an extract from remembering it happened on the 4th of December, and this is Saturday the 6th of December in the Cumberland Argus, and it said, well, you can read most of it, Thursday evening, Mayor Collett presided over a meeting, a fairly large attendance, and O'Connor, member of Legislative Council, moved that this meeting is of opinion that the time has arrived when a historical society should be formed in Parramatta to be known as the Parramatta Historical Society. So the Reverend O'Reilly, who was the Catholic priest, supported by that Frank Walker, and Freem, who was we'll hear more about him, the Mayor of Prospect and Sherwood, and also Jonas Arundel, who was also a very prominent person. That was Carol. And then the St John's rector, Samuel Johnson, he moved the second motion. Also, it was seconded by Mr Atkins, BA, and he was the first headmaster of Parramatta High School. So you can see all the prominent people who were down there, and they said that a provisional committee be appointed to draw up rules and regs. And so Alderman Collett, he was the Mayor, Moxham, Jago, Hill, Thomas, Cowman, Brown, Dr Brown, Walter Sigmund Brown, that Reverend O'Reilly, Mason, Atkins, again, R.H. Matthews, William Freed, Thomas, who came from the King's School, Jonas Arundel, Joe Button, Cowper, and the Mover. So those gentlemen, in those days no women, were the people who were entrusted to get it all going. Now, this is a list of all of the people who came along and said that they would be foundation members. And if you the Johnston family, you'll see the Nollers over here, the Freems there, and Browns, the doctor, his wife, and 2 daughters by the look of it. So they swelled the numbers with the families. 2 Miss Betts, they were descendants of Samuel Marsden. So quite a lot of important people. Bowden was a solicitor, and Keith Howson, we'll talk about him, but he's one who came along at that time. So from that original 47 members, the membership has steadily grown, and that's the last 22 years of it. So from about 130 in 1990, we're up to 261 as at the end of last year. So it's continued to grow and prosper. The Society's met continuously since those times, even through the World Wars and the Depression. And they've met nearly everywhere, I think, in Parramatta. The School of Arts, which was in Macquarie Street, the Bond House, which was where the Davis-Jones building it was knocked down for that, next to Lennox Bridge. Hugh Taylor was a councillor and a member of Parliament. Various church halls, schools, Red Cross rooms, Legacy Hall, Town Hall, and the council meeting room. So we've shifted around. Even in my time, I think I've been to 4 of those places that we've met. As I mentioned, there were all prominent Parramatta identities involved in the formation of the Society, and they were involved in lots of organisations, as well as obviously an interest in history. So we'll just have a look at some of those. The first president was James Graham. So Collett must have moved out in 1913. You remember he was the mayor, and this bloke didn't become mayor until 1915. But that was James Graham. He was an alderman on the council, and he's the Graham of if you remember Summons and Graham stop streets that were around Parramatta in the 50s and 60s probably still. But this is the sort of thing that the people were involved in. James Graham, he was on the Parramatta Parker Trust. He was a member of it, and for a time the chairman. He was a member and president for a period on the Parramatta District Hospital Committee. He was a committee man on the Parramatta School of Arts, belonged to Parramatta Bowling Club, and he was our president here from 13 to 15, so 3 years. Although 13 was really only 1 month. The next president, he came and he was president in 1916, was Walter Sigismund Brown. He was the doctor, and he lived at Brislington. You know Brislington, near the courthouse, diagonally opposite the Warpack. He was a great sportsman, and he loved his lawn bowls. He was the second son of a Dr. Walter Brown, who came from Bristol in England. Walter had trained at Guy's Hospital in London, and his father, that's the other Dr. Walter, bought Dr. Parsons' practice, which was in George Street, and renamed the house Brislington. So there had been a doctor's practice in Brislington prior to Brown, and he was the one who renamed it Brislington. And he married Margaret Isabella MacArthur, granddaughter of Hannibal MacArthur. So it must have been a small incestuous Parramatta community, I think. And he was involved on the District Hospital Committee, which is probably obvious, being a doctor. And he was a member, and he was president in 1904. He was the president for some 15 years of the Rose Hill Bowling Club, and he held various roles within our society, vice president, president and councillor. I remember the Rose Hill Bowling Club really followed out of the Woolpack Hotel Bowling Club, which was the first one established, and for which we have a set of wooden bowls in our collection here, which are amongst the first wooden bowls, lawn bowls ever made in Sydney. The next president was Samuel Johnston. He was in 1917, and he was the rector of St John's Church in Parramatta, and he had a great interest in history. He had been a school teacher in Ireland before he emigrated to Australia. He then was ordained in 1904, and he became the 5th rector of St John's in Parramatta. He and his wife were foundation members, as I pointed out earlier, and he was involved from the very beginning. He was the first secretary, then he became the president and a vice president, and then he started to get fairly heavily involved in his church activities. He was also later a foundation member of Parramatta Rotary Club. And you know the memorial gates in St John's on the Church Street side? He was the one responsible for fundraising to raise that after the First World War to put in those memorial gates, which are still there. The other things that he established during his period here, he started a League of Honour. I don't know if any of the ladies know that, but it was for young women, and I know my wife's mother was a member of that League of Honour down there. It was sort of a young women's group, and it was part of the church activities. He was the diocesan secretary. He became the rural dean of Parramatta. He then became the archdeacon of Camden, and he held both of those positions while he was still rector of St John's at Parramatta. He then relinquished those roles and he became the archdeacon of the Sydney diocese, and he also then later became canon of St Andrew's Cathedral. So he was very prominent in the church activities, and he really he was one of the inspirations that got the society going at that time. There is a plaque in his memory in St Andrew's Cathedral if you ever wander in there. The next president was William Freen, and we're looking at 1918, 1919. He was an alderman and the mayor of Prospect and Sherwood, and that basically evolved into what's now Holroyd Council. He wrote numerous historical articles for local newspapers. He was quite prolific in that. He was an engineer, and as I said, he was on the Prospect and Sherwood Council, extensive writer, and he was involved from the very first. If you might recall, he was one of the seconders for the motion in that first public meeting. He became president and vice president. And if you go into St John's Cemetery, as soon as you go through the Lich Gate, if you turn hard right, you'll find his grave. It's not very well kept, it's reasonably kept, but it's situated there. Then we had a lady, Margaret Swan, in 1920 to 22. She was a school teacher and prominent in many local groups, and the Swan family, as you know, bought Elizabeth Farm. And she was also very heavily involved in history. And if you have a look at the list of all these things that she was the eldest of 12 children to William and Elizabeth Swan. She became a school teacher, later the infants headmistress at Parramatta Public School in 1912. She was on the society from 1990, so she wasn't here at the beginning. She didn't marry, but look at the group she was involved in. The Womanhood Suffrage League, the Women's Electoral Bee, these are all Parramatta things. She was on the Teachers Federation locally. She was tied up with Knox Presbyterian. I don't know what the connection is there. She certainly was tied into Stuart House, and in fact there is a ward named in her honour at Stuart House. Now, remember Stuart House? Yeah. That's the place where the country kids come to Manly and get an opportunity to
see the sea.
See the sea and live for a part. Henry Lawson Literary Society and the League of Nations Union. So she was really into, she was a feminist obviously, and into women's rights, and very interested in history. Joe Button. He was very involved in Parramatta, and in fact there is a bridge in Parramatta Park called the Joe Button Bridge. I'll show you in a second why I got it. You know the weir down near Little Coogee? Mm-hmm. There's a pedestrian bridge that runs across. That is the Joe Button Bridge, that pedestrian bridge. So he also was a school teacher, both in England and in Scotland, and he came out in 1882. He joined the railways in their audit section, must have got sick of that, became a stationer in Church Street for a short period, and then he joined Cumberland Mercury, the newspaper, and he worked for them for 40 years, 21 years as the company secretary. He was involved in temperance organisations, various Masonic lodges, the Parramatta Highland Society, Parramatta Citizens Band. He obviously had that because he was the organist at St Andrew's Presbyterian, but he mixed that up as well, being the warden and the parish councillor at St John's. So he had both the Presbyterians and the Anglicans covered, and he was a trustee of Parramatta School of Arts. As you can see, all of these people had lots of involvement in prominent organisations in Parramatta. Here's more of his activities. United Friendly Society's Medical and Dispensing Institute. He was the secretary for that for 35 years. Now, there used to be one, and the building still exists. It's down on Parramatta Road in Granville, probably about 100 yards west of the rail crossing on the southern side. Secretary of the Parramatta Progress Association, and 25 years secretary of the Parramatta Park Trust. And probably those latter two is part of the reason why he ultimately got a bridge named after him, because of all the activities that he did. Now, he joined in 1914, so after it had just started, but he was involved actively from that period right through until 1939. What was interesting, I found, was even while he was secretary, he arranged the annual general meeting of the society in 1919 at Furhome, which is Hamilton Cottage. And there was one of the servants from Elizabeth Farm living here at that time, and so the society way back in 1919 had some involvement with Hamilton Cottage. James Jervis, he was not a president, but he was prominent around this particular period of the society's activities. He was a school teacher, a prolific author and historian, and he was a society secretary 23, 26 and vice president. We've got a whole section up in our cupboard there of all the books that James Jervis wrote. And there's the histories of Camden, Canterbury, Parramatta, you name it. There's hordes of them that he wrote. He obviously was a history teacher and part of that time was at Canterbury Boys High School, and not out in the Parramatta area as such, but he lived out here. 1935, Sydney Fuller came as headmaster, as president, sorry. So he would have been elected in March of 1935, but he was killed by a car in May 1935, so he wasn't didn't have a long term as the president of the society. And the only photo that I've been able to find, and that's him there over in the corner, and this is at Smithfield Public School, where he was headmaster, as it says down below, from 1913 to 1929 with a class. He'd been all around the traps: Goulburn, Shoalhaven, Dural, Prospect, Smithfield, Girraween, and finally Merrylands West in the schools, the last few as principal. He retired in 1934, and having retired probably in December, he became president in March and was killed tragically in the May. He was involved in Parramatta Rotary. He was the Oddfellows Lodge. He got to Grand Master. He was the secretary of the Parramatta branch of the Teachers Federation, and he was a trustee and circuit steward for the Lee Memorial Church in Parramatta. All prominent in activities. Keith Howson, I mentioned he was one of the people who came along as a foundation member, and he was 12 years old when he joined the society as a foundation member. He was very interested in history. The house and family went further back. His grandfather was James Howson, which we have a book that John McClyman started to write, and Enid and I finished it off for him after he passed away, in which we sell down here, which is the whole history of the house and family. So he joined, as I said, as a 12-year-old. They waited a few years, obviously, until he was, about 21, before he became a vice president, so he must have been actively involved. Secretary and treasurer and president for 26 years, 1936 to... So he was the longest serving president, and he covered really those war years and the post-war years. What was interesting going through the minutes books is the society, through his initiation, declared him to be a life president in 1956, and I don't think there's many organisations where you get nominated as life president. He was the first fellow of our society, and he was vice patron for some years until he passed away in 1965. But not only being involved in the Parramatta Society, he was involved in the Royal Australian Historical Society from 1928, so that he would have been 27 when he became a councillor there. And he was on there for, how many is that, 33 years? A councillor. He was secretary at various stages, treasurer, vice president, and became president of that and a fellow of that society. So very prominent in those activities, and our longest serving president. Gwenda Howson, which was his sister, well, she wasn't the president, she was the society secretary for all those periods that he was president. And she was prominent in various activities. That's her in the VAD, Volunteer Aid Detachment, isn't it called? Uniform, of which she was the commandant for the Parramatta area, and I'll show you some of the activities. But both Gwenda and Keith were orphans. Their parents died fairly early, and they were brought up by other members of the family. But they lived in the Bond House next to Lennox Bridge. So she was a sister involved in philanthropic. Red Cross VAT, I'd mentioned. She was the first treasurer of the Cheslon Nursing Home. She was the president of the Royal Ride Homes. She was the treasurer many years of the YWCA in Parramatta, Women's Pioneer Society, and you can see she was secretary. Then after that, vice president, a vice patron, and she also became a fellow of the society. So very involved, and it's these people who helped the society continue in its operations during those years. Their membership would not have been large, and unfortunately some of the records through the Howson period were destroyed, and the society doesn't have them. We have minute books and records prior to their period and everything since their period, but unfortunately some of those have disappeared. After that long period of Keith Howson being president, Rock Davis was sort of brought in as the president. I think it was reluctantly took over, and he stood for a period and then stood down. You can see it's just for about a year he was involved. But he had a colourful background. He was a marine engineer, and he really was Rock Davis III. His grandfather was born at sea, and the master of the ship happened to be called Rock Jones. So his parents called him Rock Davis. Now we had a story that the ship was passing the Rock of Gibraltar, and that he was born near the Rock of Gibraltar, and that's why he was called Rock. But I had correspondence with the family, and they gave me some photos and some background. But they claimed that was not correct, and it was really the master of the ship. And if you think at that time, the Suez Canal hadn't been opened, so there would have been no reason to head into the Mediterranean Sea, and most of those ships that came usually headed for the Canary Islands and Rio de Janeiro, and then across to the Cape of Good Hope.
I think I've heard of other people being called after the captain of the ship too.
Yeah, oh yeah. So the grandfather and the father were his grandfather, and his father was also called Rock, so him being then the son of that, he was the third. And in fact there is another one, and the other one was still alive a few years ago, also Rock Davis. Now they were very prominent in the Brisbane water area as shipbuilders.
Davistown.
Yeah, and it commenced at Davistown. So they were all around that area, but they commenced particularly there. But what was interesting, his father had married Mary McMaster, and that's McMaster's Beach up there, so they were involved heavily in that area. So he was president for a short period, vice president, and he seemed to have just stayed for a period and moved on. So, we got to the early 60s, 62, 3. So in the early 1960s, there was quite a revival of interest in the society, and a large number of new members came in during that period. People that were people like Frank Bloxham and Hilda Bloxham, and a whole lot of them in fact came in 1963 from the history evening class at Parramatta Evening College. So that was sort of a recruiting ground for that, and it has been during John McClimate's time. Quite a few people joined out of the Parramatta Evening College. So it still goes, and they really represented the youth and enthusiasm after a long period under one president. I think it had probably stagnated a bit after such a long period. I think Keith Howson's health was going down, and a new group of people sort of started to push the society in a new direction. At that time, they wanted to find a home because most of the meetings had been held at the Bond House, which had been their regular meeting place, but it got sold in 1959, and they also wanted to establish a museum. They were looking at several properties around Parramatta, and but fortunately Hambleton Cottage had been acquired from by the Parramatta Council in the about 1953. They'd operated it as a museum, a folk museum, unsuccessfully, and it had started to go into some decline, and they didn't know what to do with it, and the Parramatta Society saw it as an opportunity. There was a move for Hambleton Cottage to go possibly to the National Trust, but in particular one of the prominent Parramatta identities, a bloke called Bill Matthews, who had an engineering supplies shop on Church Street, on I don't know what street's called, near the railway, where the railway, near the hotel, near the commercial hotel opposite the railway.
Smith Street.
Yeah,
Smith?
it's probably the continuation of Smith Street, just past the Lancer Barracks. He lobbied hard for Hambleton Cottage to stay under Parramatta control. In other words, if it went to the National Trust, it would be run out of Sydney, and they would lose control of it. It already having two properties in Parramatta, and also the Historic Houses Trust was starting to be formed, and it had Elizabeth Farm. So he won the day, and our society obtained a lease in 1965 of the cottage itself. Not the coach house here, but the cottage itself. So, as part of that, the Parramatta Council was responsible for the fabric of the building, and the Society did some internal restorations, furnished it, and provided guides for guided tours. And that's the current arrangement still. As you see outside, all the work that's going on the building, Parramatta Council pays for and supervise, but anything inside the cottage we're responsible for. And it was officially opened on the 26th of February 1966 by a Macarthur descendant, Major General Sir Denzil Macarthur Onslow. In 1988, the Society was able to extend that lease to cover the coach house. It had been used by the Parramatta Art Society.
Jess was at that opening.
Were you? 66?
Yes.
Ah.
I have an invitation still in my Betty to photostep a years ago.
Yeah. We got I don't know about the invitation. We got the program a lot from Clary Wallace, who was the president at the time, and we had further restoration work, major restoration in 2003, and we had New South Wales Government came out to officially open that. So Clary Wallace became the president in 1964 after Rock Davis, and if you recall, they got the lease in 1965, and so he was there through till 66 after the official opening of the cottage as a museum. And he was heavily involved in setting up Hambleton Cottage, along with a lot of enthusiastic new members that I mentioned. He was about 35 years old at that time, and there's some lovely photos of him at the opening ceremony with his two young daughters. And Clary still is alive, and he lives down in Tasmania. And hopefully he might come to he said he would, but I don't know how his health's going, to our centenary later this year. So he was an upholsterer by trade. He seemed to live or work around the Concord area, but he helped to stabilise the society after the Long Howson period. And some of the names of people, some of the longer standing members would recognise some of them, but the people involved in setting up Faye Scurra.
No, excuse me, Ken, it was Flo
Scurra. Flo, it was too. Yeah. Leslie Harwin, Hilda and Frank Bloxham, Leslie Tobin. Now, is that a he or a she?
It's girls, it's boy spelling.
Yeah, I know. I presume it is. Beryl Louis, who wrote the Cottage on the Plain book that we have on Hambleton. Perce Glover, who was heavily involved in the tours. And Ron Normington and his wife were involved, and a whole lot of new members. So Clary had been the treasurer for a period on the council, vice president. Then he did a short period as president and a fellow, but for some reason he withdrew from the society. I think there was a little bit of personality clash, and he withdrew after the cottage was established. I've sort of spoken to him, and that's about all he'll say as to what happened at the time. The next one was Peter Dodd, and he took over after Clary retired, and he was an industrial chemist. He worked down at Alcan, down at Clyde, and he lived in Wavertree over in New Zealand Street near Macarthur Girls High School. He only passed away last year, towards the end of last year. Betty knew him well. Undertook a review. He got in and he reviewed the Constitution, and what they did decide at that time was to limit the terms of the principal officers of the society. As you can see, when Keith Howson was president, he was president for 26 years. And you really need a re-injection of young blood and new blood to make an organisation vibrant. And so they limited the periods to 5 years for the President, Secretary and Treasurer. He initiated tours around Parramatta and tours of Parramatta, and particularly his wife was involved because Wavertree, this is before the council established their information centre, Wavertree was really an unofficial tourist office for Parramatta, and they organised lots of tours around that area. So he was involved in the council and president and vice president, but they moved away in 1980 to the eastern suburbs. King's Cross, yeah. Partly through his work and their involvement. Now, when you opened the museum, you needed guides, and initially all the guided tours were conducted by Leslie Harwin. There was also the Society Secretary, the caretaker, she lived on the premises, and the curator. And Jean might be able to comment more on this, but she ran the tours and she didn't want anyone's help for a long, long time until her health came down. She would run tours every day. Because she lived on the property, and they were always done Leslie's way. But she eventually allowed a few people to get involved. Geraldine Palmer got partly involved with her, and she was apparently the next person that she allowed to sort of become an assistant guide for a period. But then her health went down and she couldn't continue, and then they had to get volunteers to act as guides. And Enid Clark was involved in organising this task and getting. You were in the first group, Jean.
Yeah, that was 86.
86.
October 86 was
Yeah.
the first meeting.
So that she organised and got a whole group of guides together and started it off. And then Betty, she's coordinated the guides since 1998, doing a sterling job. And quite different to all the other properties. All visitors here are given guided tours from one of our 40 to 45 guides. It varies every day, doesn't it? So if you look back, the 1960s, the 1970s and the 1980s were periods when membership increased and the activities increased. Tours started to be undertaken. Displays were being used. People like Frank Bloxham and Hilda were heavily involved in those. The tours, I got a name right this time, Jane. Flo Scarra and Perce Glover did hordes of tours, and we were even commenting on the tour on Sunday that Perce Glover always arranged fine weather for the tours, just as we had last summer. And as I mentioned, Beverly Dodd, that was Peter Dodd's wife, ran tours around Parramatta from Wavertree, and the Constitution rules were updated. After being established in 1914, they were eventually updated in 50 years later. Heritage. The Society has lent its weight to save threatened properties from demolition, and they were active way back from that period. In the early stages of the National Trust, when it was trying to get some teeth, as you'd say, to be quite prominent in protecting heritage, unfortunately St Marlow at Hunters Hill was knocked down, and Subiaco at Rydalmere, it was knocked down in 1961 too. So that was Hannibal MacArthur's former property. But they were involved, and particularly It helped to raise public awareness, and Old Government House, Experiment Farm, Elizabeth Farm certainly were saved, and also Lennox Bridge suffered an attempt to demolish it some years ago, but that didn't occur. So the Society has been involved, although it's one of our secondary activities rather than the primary activities. Frank Bloxham, so this is when the real, after having established the museum, they started to move on to other things. And Frank, that's an early picture of Frank, and he ensured a smooth changeover to through to Frank, and he arranged many displays. He was an engineer. He started his own company in 1968 making bulk handling equipment, and right up till his death basically he was still involved in it, although the family were running it. He developed numerous displays, and in the town hall down here there was a museum display area down here at one period, and there was displays put up at various places. It was over 30 years on the Society Council, and you can see he was involved actively as Vice President Councillor. He was President for 9 years there, and he must have, even though they limited the period, he must have been given a second go at it, a fellow and Vice Patron.
Him and Hilda used to run dinner parties to raise money.
Yeah.
See these two cabinets somewhere? Where is that one?
There's two
I
big
went to a
ones.
dinner party to raise money
This
for
one,
that.
yeah. And until he passed away in 2010. Then John McClimate came along, and John was involved, and he did 2 terms, as you can see. So we're limited down to the 5 years then, and then he had to stand down for a period, and he came back for another 3 years. He was an author of books on that, and he introduced the committee system which we have in the Society now. People get horrified when we, certainly when I've been visiting other places, and say that we have about 28 committees. But really what we've done and what was started there is there's 28 activities within the Society, and the main aim is to give one person responsible for carriage of that activity, whether it's membership or whether it's the library or tours or guest speakers, and you quickly get your 20 odd committees.
Yeah, that happened the year that I was started on council, so I remember it vividly.
Yeah. So a few have been dropped and a few added into that, but it still works well, and so each of the councillors have a specific role. Some of them have several committees to look after, but it allows someone to focus and be responsible for that activity and to report on it. So that he had been a school teacher, mainly a physical ed teacher. He was involved up at Point Wollstonecraft, the National Fitness Campaign. He was involved up in that area for a period. In fact, Beverly was also a school teacher, his wife. Then he got involved in Parramatta Evening College as a teacher and an author. As I said, he introduced the committee system, and he was the first one who started using coaches for, bus coaches for Society tours. Prior to that, all the tours were done in by carpooling and going out in various cars, but it moved forward to that. And so he was involved from 1981 basically through to the early 2000s, and it would have gone to about 2002 when he basically was not actively involved. Became a fellow of our society, but he also got involved in the Royal Australian, was a councillor there, vice president and senior vice president, and was made a fellow of the Royal Australian Historical Society. Jim Hoskin came along after that. Jim had been a school teacher and was principal of James Roos Agricultural High School, and he was probably the principal who helped raise that school to the prominence that it has these days as basically the top government high school, or even the top high school in the state. He was very involved in saving Lennox Bridge, which was on at that time, and he was involved in the society through the various offices. Judith Dunn followed that, 93 to 97, and as you know, she's done all these sort of cemetery transcription program and published related books. She was a school assistant, then she started her own tour company, Pastime Tours. She's also a tour guiding teacher at TAFE, although TAFE has cut that out and those courses are no longer run other than at Ultimo. So she's no longer doing that. And she was involved through, from 1985 through as president and vice president through to 2006, and also a fellow of the society. Around about this time, the Family History Group was established in December 1994, and there was a considerable opposition from the members of the society to the formation of such a group. Many of them stated that the Family History Group will spend all the money and send the society broke, and
We're still trying.
and it apparently was quite a heated discussion at the time. It's before I was involved. Enid was involved then, certainly, and Jean. But eventually...
I was told that family history had nothing to do with history in Parramatta.
Yeah.
A number of prominent people.
Yeah, well, there's quite a number. But it's proved to be a great success. And in fact, a lot of the people who were opposed and quite vocal at the time have admitted and stated that they had taken the wrong stance and that the formation of it was a great success.
They kept quoting another society that had a problem, it seems, as I recall. They kept quoting this other society. So on the strength of that, they
If you went into some country town somewhere, we like the Martins and the Corleys. The historical society be on one side of the river, the family history group be on the other side, and if they had guns, they'd have shot each other.
But and that still exists in some of the towns. There's
Well, you
still
keep it under one umbrella.
two separate groups, and there's not that many that have it all under one umbrella. And it's interesting to talk to some of these groups as to the reasons, and it's usually personality clashes and power.
Supposed
Power.
surmised threat.
Yeah.
Something.
Anyhow, it's very been active and published 2 pioneer registers, and they really provide the research skills to assist the society, the people. We then, over the last 12 years, have been moving to what you'd call, what the museum and organisations calls best practice. So in 1998 we established a strategic planning and budgeting process, which is still continues as an annual routine. In 2004 we were invited by Museum and Galleries New South Wales to participate in their standards program, which was a program to help you towards best practice. And we've built on that program, and we've developed various policies and procedures, and we've assisted many other museums and societies by sharing copies of these with them, or inviting them over to see what we do, and them adapting our customs to how they run their things. And out of that strategic planning process, we established a vision and what we would like to be and aspire to be as the local authority on both local and family history. contrary to what Bob said, and the heritage of Parramatta, to operate Hambleton Cottage as a historic house museum, 1820s, 80s colonial Georgian cottage, and that's our vision and what we aim to do. So then they had to suffer me. I came along, and so I've done 2 periods, 01 to 4, and I told you that we limited the period to 5 years. In 1999, we revised the Constitution, and I was involved in that, and I thought I might end up as president, so I limited the period to 4 years. And in fact, we also introduced at that time 2 yearly elections. Rather than having election every year, we have an election every 2 years, and the officers stand for 2 years. And we start on the 1st of January and finished on the 31st of December, rather than the middle of March through to the middle of March, because basically when they were doing that for 1 year, you really only president for 9 months of a year, because December's nearly a write-off, January is certainly a write-off, and March really don't do anything because the elections are coming up. So I got involved in this best practice program. My background is not history, it's a professional engineer, and one of the things when I joined the council, I joined the society in 97 and became a councillor in 98, and John McClimate was the president at the time, and I started asking questions about did we have a budget and what we were planning to do, and I won the job, and I said, all right, well, I'll write you a strategic plan and do you a budget. And since then I've developed all these various policies of collection management, disaster preparedness, etc., etc. A whole lot of policies as part of this best practice. So I was involved for about 3 years as a councillor, and then I took over as president, and in those periods I did secretary, and I'm secretary now and a fellow. But I led the society with the standards program, and for my sins of doing that, Museum and Galleries said after I'd finished, they invited me to join their museum review as a consultant in 2005, and that was to go to other museums and review them as part of the standards program. So I did that for 7 years in New South Wales, and I did 3 years in Queensland. That's Museum Gallery Services Queensland. Another girl and I helped Queensland set up, because they introduced the standards program at that stage, and it went on. So that was a most fascinating period for me, because
Hambleton Cottage. Oh.
Someone got it.
Oh, that's coming up. I've got the voice.
Because I was able to help other museums and tell them what we'd done, and for them to adapt it and apply it. But I got, as well as giving knowledge out, I gained a lot, because no matter which museum you went to, you gained some knowledge from what they were. So I did a whole, Queensland I did a whole group around Cairns, around Rockhampton, and around Brisbane, and in this one we went down the central, out the central west, we went to far north, Yamba, Grafton, Wollongong, etc., Young, Yass, everywhere. Anyhow, it was, and I thought after 6 years, I told them, they still want me to do it, but I said, you should be sick of me by now, get someone else. That's what, but it was a great experience, that. So David followed me, David Shakespeare. He'd been a school teacher and ended up as principal of Arthur Phillip. And I think the thing that we could look to David is he established strong links with the local schools and with HMAS Parramatta. Poor old David's been in hospital for the last couple of weeks. He rang me last night, he rang Enid. He still doesn't sound well. He had his operation, it's the sand. He went to Mount Wilga for rehabilitation where he got an infection and some pneumonia, and he was sent back to the sand, and he only got out Monday. So he's hopefully on the road to recovery. So he'd been a school teacher. He was initially a primary school teacher, and then as part of that he did an arts degree, and he became an English history teacher in secondary schools. But he got involved in Parramatta Evening College, and he was the deputy there in 1964, and he was the principal there for 20 years apparently. And then after that he became principal of Arthur Phillip High School. So he's been around the Parramatta area in education for many years, and I conned him into getting on the council in 2001, and he's still involved and was president and made a fellow last year. So it's just the opportunity to gather with some of these people. And following David, I did a short period, and then 3 years, and then Trevor came along. And Trevor's a pharmacist. He was a pharmacist in Pennant Hills and Harris Park and various places. And he's one of the things I suggested out of his expertise was to try and publicise the society, and I think he's done that excellently. We certainly are getting hordes of publicity in the papers.
Which isn't easy.
Which isn't easy. He personally goes and arranges a meeting with the editor of the Advertiser and the editor of the Parramatta Sun, and goes through the things, and it's got the in to get them in. That iMag magazine I mentioned over there, which we circulate out of here, we get a whole half-page ad in that every month for free. He provides the text, and we get that for tea. And there's, I think, 15,000 of those issued throughout the area. So it all helps. Yeah, he does it. Hills TV magazine. So he's involved in all those things. And this is the place that we enjoy, Hambleton Cottage.
When are you going to get a new photo?
Oh, that's a beautiful
That's lovely.
That's when it was painted white before we had all this gardening done and all that.
Doesn't
Look
look
at the
as
old
Red
letterbox.
is gone anyway.
well, the letterbox. Yeah, it's still there.
No, it's different.
The
No,
one over the
that's
back
the old
is
one.
roof
Oh,
on
yes.
the service wing too.
Oh, that looks nice.
Yeah.
We've got a better one on the screensaver on that computer.
That's the one I took.
So, if we think of Hambleton Cottage and the museum, we do have items of national and international significance. If you think of, Samuel Marsden's desk and things like this, we do have things. We have the association with the MacArthur family being the second house on the Elizabeth Farm estate. It has great aesthetic significance in what it is, and it's a fine and rare colonial era cottage, which hasn't undergone too much structural change. Certainly there has been structural change, but I think there's a lot of that's pushing the wrong button. A lot of early fabric still exists, and we were fortunate to get listed on the state after a lot of period of pushing. I've been pushing the council for some years, and eventually we were able to get their support to push forward. And on the 21st, I think, it stated the 22nd, but she came on the day before the certificate date of September last year. We were given the State Heritage Register listing, and it's the cottage, the grounds, and the archaeology, because beneath the surface there are some sands which are of heritage value, and also the grounds, which includes all the trees in the reserve. So the whole listing is of the group, and whilst that's a certificate that summarises, There's about 30 pages on their website, which they got wrong, and
Almost everything.
virtually everything Benny, wasn't it? And so Benny made some comments, and I got stuck into it and gave them a new version of what it really was, because they'd done it as what you'd call a desk exercise. I doubt whether they even visited the place, and they were using reports that had been superseded by other reports and facts that were wrong. Anyhow, what's on there, I'd give it a mark of 98 to 99, because they didn't adopt everything I said.
Otherwise they'd have got 100.
Yeah. But it's truer what's on there.
Yeah.
So, what's happened over the period of the cottage and the society? Guides book came out. John McClymont issued the first one. I then elaborated on it and photographed all the items and include photographs in it. And we've gone away from that detailed one to shorter guides notes to assist the guides. Interpretation, when the caretaker's area was vacated, those two northerly rooms, rather than just look at what we would do to those two rooms, we decided to have a look at the cottage as a whole and start with a blank sheet of paper and decide what we would do with it. And whilst most of it stayed the same, we did change the character of one of the rooms and turn that caretaker space into an exhibition area. And basically all of the recommendations have been implemented from that. But that was a good project and involved a lot of the members. This resource centre here, this room was established for members with a reference library, an extensive reference library as you can see, a lending library which is down in the members room, computing equipment, etc. And we've been able to establish a computer database following our collection management procedures for our total collection, everything in the house, the library and our archive. So it's all properly catalogued and keyword. You can interrogate it on keywords and find where the various bits are. The current activities, as you know, we do monthly meetings on 10 months of the year with guest speakers. There's monthly family history group meetings here on the first Saturday for 10 months, and the December one's a Christmas party. There's bi-monthly tours to historic places, and last Sunday we went to Narellan and around that area. There's a research service which for local and family history, and every Tuesday there's a group of people doing research, archiving, cataloguing down here, and it's the day I say bring your earplugs, because there's a lot of talk and but social activity, but a lot of work done. And the research, we're getting numerous inquiries and we get quite a bit of money. We charge $20 for those. We've increased it from 15 to 20 this year, and that's going well. We publish and we sell books, and there's guided tours, as we mentioned earlier. Publications, I wouldn't call us very prolific. With journals, we've only issued 8 journals in the whole 100 years, except we're going to publish one this year, so there'll be 9 in 100 years. And I don't think you'd call that very prolific. But they are of high quality, and they've got certainly some of those early ones are very good. Some of the facts have been superseded, but basically they are correct, and there's some good stuff in it. Cemetery books, St Patrick's, St John's, Mayers Hill, All Saints, Old Wesleyan, and St Paul's and the isolated graves are underway, but they've been done. Cottage on the Plain, and we're hoping to update it. We've sold all the copies, or there might be 1 or 2 left. I've applied for a grant from the council to publish that, and we'll redo it. A couple of pioneer registers. Men of Parramatta was done. and the James Howson book was also published. So, if you look back at what I consider, we've had a centenary of our success, 100 years, and it really goes to the enthusiasm of the presidents, and I think they sort of stamp their signature on the activities, plus the council officers, the people who are involved. They certainly are involved in that process, and all the members, and particularly since the 1960s, I think has moved ahead. And I consider anyhow that the historical site has progressed to be the local authority on family and history, local and family history, as well as a well-respected operator of Hambleton Cottage, operating under best practice. And we do get praise from even the National Trust on how the property is kept, and I think they're jealous of some of the things that occur, but we tell them that we've got our people and you keep yours. So,
We've got a few split
there's lots of allegiances. There's Mary who looks after Experiment Farm, involved at our government house, involved on our council, etc. There's quite a few. So thank you. That's just a summary of the action.